Hello everyone, I'm Marianne Mashiri. Welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us tomorrow. With me, our political strategist, Joe Tanner, and Anand Menon, Director of UK in a Changing Europe, a research group focusing on UK-EU relations. Before we talk to them, though, let's take a look at some of those front pages first. And Captain Tom Moore's knighthood is well covered by The Sun, which says he's the first of many coronavirus crisis heroes who will be honoured. Many of the papers focus on schools reopening. The Times casts doubt over the date of June the 1st for reopening, saying it depends on the status of the UK's track and trace system. The Telegraph says the British Medical Association thinks schools can open in June, so long as it is safe to do so. The Guardian says up to 1,500 primary schools could remain closed after several councils said they wouldn't force them to reopen. Meanwhile, the Mail accuses a teaching union of using cynical tactics to stop schools from reopening. The Metro reports on the blame game emerging in Whitehall between the government and its scientific advisers. Those warnings on the economy from the Chancellor are the lead story in the Express. And the Daily Star says millions of Britons are planning to swap summer holidays abroad for camping trips in the UK. Well, let's begin now and talk to you, Joe and Anand. Thank you, both of you, for taking the time to join us virtually for the paper review. Let's start by talking about the FT front page. Anand, to you, Rishi Sunak, of course, has been talking about the recession, about the way the recession might end up looking. And the front page of the FT, Sunak dashes bounce-back hopes as jobless claims soar above 2 million. I mean, these are looking like pretty dark times for the economy, understandably.
Yeah, the figures are unprecedented. You can see in the picture on the front page that chart of people claiming unemployment. And the key thing is the Chancellor was giving evidence today to a Lords committee. And the key phrase was, he said, it might be that the economy will not bounce back. Many economists had been hoping for what they call a V-shaped recovery. That is to say, the economy would go down, but immediately afterwards go back almost to where it had started from quite quickly. Now I think they're even thinking that a U-shaped recovery, where there's a longer dip at the bottom, is looking less likely. And some people are even thinking about a sort of L-shaped crisis that we bump along the bottom for a while. So the Chancellor is preparing us for the fact that the economy is not going to recover quickly. And as you say, the jobless figures are astounding, a 69% rise in the number of people claiming unemployment benefit in 1 month. And of course, remember that large parts of the workforce are currently protected by the government's furlough scheme. And we don't have any idea how many of those people are going to have jobs to go back to as that scheme starts to end. And employers are going to have to start taking on the burden of paying some of those salaries from August, I think, if I remember rightly. And at that point, we'll get a clearer idea of how many of those people are kept on.
And Joe, really quite, honest words from Rishi Sunak. I mean, he's laying it down as he sees it. He says there's no doubt there will be more hardship to come.
Absolutely, and I think there is a degree, isn't there, that Rishi Sunak has been heralded quite a lot during this crisis for his performance, for the way that he has designed this scheme with his team at Treasury, in terms of the furlough scheme that has currently, I think, according to the FT, paid out over £11 billion already, in terms of to those workers that are already at home on 80% pay. So the challenge for him is that really there's no way of hiding really from the economic picture, because all the data is going to be out there. So actually it's better that he's as honest as he can be, but ultimately he's still playing with a lot of unknowns, because there's so much of this crisis and how it's affecting business that we really still don't know.
And of course, Anand, the point here is that the key to the recovery in the economy, whenever or however long that may take, is businesses being able to reopen. But given the current circumstances, how difficult is that going to be?
Well, very difficult, because obviously when businesses reopen is a matter as much for the medical experts as it is for the government at the moment. And that depends on the figures with the coronavirus. But it depends not just on businesses reopening. It also depends on the British people being willing to go out and start spending again. Even if the high streets reopen, and we're not sure how many people will flock there, will restaurants find that people want to go and eat there in sort of groups of people, even if they're allowed to? So there are a lot of unknowns about how quickly the economy will be able to bounce back, even as lockdown starts to be lifted.
Let's talk about schools. Lots of papers with the school story on their front page. I mean, it's a big deal, isn't it, in the UK? People are genuinely worried about sending their kids back to school. Other people are keen to send their kids back to school. Let's start with the front page of The Times. A doubt cast over date for school reopening. Joe, it says here the reopening of schools in 10 days' time thrown into doubt last night after the government's most senior scientific advisor suggested that it would depend on an effective test, trace and isolate system. That's something that we hadn't, I don't think, heard before.
No, Dame Angela McLean, the Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor, had said that essentially implied that ministers have been told that changes to the lockdown would require an effective system for tracing and isolating new cases to be in place. And there's definitely wording now that Downing Street had said that Boris Johnson's roadmap always had said that June the 1st was the earliest schools should reopen, provided that the tests were being met. So there is a degree of, it looks as though there's a little bit of movement now. There's obviously opposition from councils, there's concern from unions, and there's ultimately concern from parents. I mean, my son is a year 7 pupil, so he's actually in the first year of secondary school. And it's not so much of a concern for me because he's not currently in line to go back that soon. But I've heard from many parents who are seriously worried about sending their children back, particularly the primary school ages. And
you just touched there, Joe, on the councils. Anand, the front page of The Guardian, talking about rebellion amongst some councils joining the opposition to the plan. In Birmingham, Calderdale in West Yorkshire, Conservative-controlled Solihull, these councils apparently saying that they may not force schools to reopen.
No, absolutely. It's fascinating how so many of the papers have a slightly different angle on this return to school story. And you're right, for The Guardian, what they're saying is a number of councils have either said, no, we're not going to open the schools, or have expressed doubts. And what has happened is the government has said, we're not going to issue sanctions against those areas that don't open their schools. And if they're not going to issue sanctions, then actually what the government is saying is, OK, if you're not happy to open, then don't open. So the government has slightly lost control of this. And you hear in the language now coming from Number 10, you know, early June wasn't always going to be the earliest date when we wanted to reopen schools, that they're rowing back slightly from what sounded like a hope that they could get schools back that early. And, you know, what we're seeing is resistance, both political and from teachers' unions at the moment, that is forcing a rethink.
Joe, has the government's language been unhelpful, do you think?
Well, I think there's lots of concern about the government's language on a lot of this process and how it's been interpreted. I think we've all seen social media videos which have suggested how things have been differently interpreted, for example. And I think the reality is that these are very complicated issues, but with regards to schools, when we've already got parents that are very worried, I think the language, you can read into lots of different things around what's been said. And I think, interestingly, the Telegraph, for example, has focused on the fact that the BMA have apparently dropped their opposition to schools reopening. But interestingly, actually they appear somewhat split, because a council chair had written to members taking a very strong stance about not engaging with the government's plans, but yet now a further letter has been written from the BMA, which is suggesting that, you know, the BMA does want schools to reopen. So again, more confusion, more uncertainty for parents when they're looking really to professionals, and you know, read these headlines with some dismay.
Yes, absolutely. The front page of the Telegraph, the BMA dropping opposition to schools reopening, and the BMA have been, you know, had written a letter, hadn't they, just suggesting that they were unhappy about schools reopening June the 1st. They've now changed their stance. I suppose the real issue here is, you know, there are mixed messages coming from all over the place, aren't there? And parents are genuinely worried.
Yeah, I think it is very, very confusing for parents. It's also very, very confusing for teachers and for school kids, because you have all these different groups, whether it's doctors, whether it's government, whether it's councils, saying contradictory things. It cannot be easy. And if your child's welfare and health is on the line, then actually what you'd like is some clear messaging. And even the BMA, it seems, is incapable of that sort of clear messaging, because they have rowed back slightly on a letter that their chairman sent a week ago when it advised teachers not to engage with the government. And now the line from the BMA is, we want schools to go back if it's safe. Of course, the devil with all these things is in the detail. When it's safe is a very loaded term. It'll never be entirely safe, so you're dealing with degrees of risk here. And the question is whether parents will feel that the degree of risk is at an acceptable level or not. And I think as long as there's this uncertainty and these mixed messages, it will be very, very hard for them to do so.
I mean, Joe, writing in the Daily Telegraph, the chairman of the BMA's Public Health Medicine Committee says basically a zero risk approach is not possible. This is about safe being an acceptable level of risk. And I think, the point that some people want to make, Joe, is that ultimately there's never going to be a situation where there's zero risk of anything.
Yeah, and I think that is the climate that we are now living in, isn't it? It's a case of if you can work from home, work from home. But if you can't, then you should go to work. But you have to be safe in doing so. And there's a suggestion that workplaces have to be made safe by employers, and schools are a very major workplace for many teachers up and down the country, as well as a place of learning. And ultimately, with so many different people attending those places every day, we are certainly never going to be entering a period of zero risk.
Anand, let's bring in the Daily Mail. Again, we're talking about schools, this time another different angle, this time talking about the relationship between teachers, their unions and headmasters and headmistresses. Yeah,
and the Daily Mail have decided that part of the problem lies with the teacher unions, who are being unhelpful, who are being deliberately oppositional, and the Daily Mail have decided that part of the problem lies with the teacher unions, who are being unhelpful, who are being deliberately oppositional, who are even threatening headmasters who try to get their staff back to work. This is based on a Zoom meeting for thousands of union members that happened today. Again, I don't think this tone is necessarily particularly helpful, because ultimately all sides are going to have to sit down and agree on a strategy for people going back to work. It's quite clear that the Mail have decided that the fall guy in this story should be the unions, which is a good way of trying to put pressure on schools to reopen without criticising teachers per se.
OK, let's move on to the Daily Telegraph again. Joe, this story here in the Telegraph, virus deaths could tail off by the end of June. Now, this is according to scientists at the University of Oxford. They say that over the next 4 to 6 weeks, there will be small rises and falls in the number of deaths, but they expect that not to find any coronavirus listed on the ONS death data by the end of June. What do you make of that? Do you think that's looking at it with a too positive light, or do you think it's realistic?
I think it's fascinating if it were to come true, and would be hugely welcome. But I think the reality is that many people will be sceptical, and obviously, the interesting thing is, how is this data being put together? Because ultimately, we are going to be seeing a relaxing of rules from June the 1st. So the idea that there will be rises and falls sounds plausible, but the issue is how significant those rises are, and actually how painful is it before we get to the point of no more deaths? Is it that we will have considerable deaths in the run up to that? And I think the issue here is that this is a prediction, but we've seen many predictions of what might happen. We certainly have seen of lowering of deaths, but then of course by the time we get to tomorrow, we'll have the weekend numbers as well factored in, won't we? And that obviously is always a bigger concern.
Anand, we saw in Italy, for example, which is of course ahead of us in terms of its troubles with the coronavirus pandemic, its daily death toll rising considerably today. So it does show, doesn't it, that you can get these big rises and falls, can't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the other issue is if your cases are increasingly concentrated, as ours seem to be in care homes, that's another issue. It seems to me that getting this totally under control will mean getting under control in care homes as well. The scientist who's been speaking here, Carl Hennigan, who's a professor of evidence-based medicine, is an interesting guy in the sense that he was one of the people who was arguing quite early on that cases might have peaked even before lockdown, that actually social distancing was having more of an impact than lockdown. So he's always, if you like, been relatively, well, I'm not sure upbeat is the right word, but on the sort of hawkish end of saying we might be able to release things earlier. And this, if it turns out to be true, it's fantastic news. If it really is the case that his modelling is suggesting that we will see that the deaths go right down to zero by the end of June, that will be a very, very positive sign indeed.
That would be, wouldn't it? Let's move on to the Financial Times. Anand, to you. Facebook opens new aisle to revenues, the shopping challenge to Amazon. So Facebook yesterday unveiled a shopping service to rival online retailers Amazon and eBay on the as the social media group moves to cash in on the habits of its 2.6 billion users. Can it rival Amazon and eBay? I mean, they are just phenomenal right now, aren't they?
Well, they claim they don't want to rival Amazon. There are two things about this story that struck me. Firstly, it is another COVID story in the sense that Facebook Shops has been moved forward because we're doing so much more shopping online now. So Facebook have brought forward their plans to launch this because so many of us are shopping a lot more online now. But the comparative advantage of Facebook, as they would see it, is that they are able to track data. So what they say in the story is that Facebook would use accumulated data to improve things. If you browse a shop, we will see this and be able to give you recommendations better tailored for you. I think privacy campaigners might sort of raise a red flag at this and think, okay, what is the data being used for? And is Facebook using this data for correct purposes all the time? But I think it's in that lies the specificity of the Facebook offer, is they have so much data on people that they can tailor retail offers to people far more accurately maybe than other online sites.
That is true. Let's move on and talk about the Express newspaper front page. Captain Tom's knighthood. Joe, to you first of all, this is great news, isn't it? Captain Tom will be given a knighthood.
Yeah, it's wonderful. So Captain Sir Tom Moore is going to be. It's one of those welcome stories where we hear of the honours, and instead of us all kind of sighing, wondering why somebody's getting something, I think this is going to be one of those stories that people around the country will unite behind. He's had an absolutely incredible time with his fundraising efforts, raising a phenomenal amount of money, nearly 33 million in the end. And actually, I think, for his family and for him, I mean, he's so modest. I'd sort of love to have seen his reaction when he found out, because he's all along has always been so grateful to everyone for their support and almost wondering why he's got so much attention. But actually, he's been a massive inspiration for young and old, which has been one of the rare feel-good stories in this whole terrible time.
Captain Tom Moore, Anand, was what we needed during lockdown, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, a genuine, no-holds-barred sort of good story. People keep telling what a divided nation we are, but he is someone we can all unite around. I mean, what he did was truly remarkable. I think even the most churlish amongst us who might say, well, actually, why do we need to raise £33 million via this way? Why isn't the government paying it? Will recognise that his own personal achievement was absolutely stupendous. To do that at his age and to do it with such good grace, as Joe says, was quite remarkable. And it's nice to see the honour system being used to reward people who've done genuinely good things.
And what do you make of the Daily Telegraph's front page story? Tourism chiefs call for extra bank holiday. So apparently tourism chiefs Visit Britain are proposing an extra bank holiday in October to help boost the industry, basically, in the UK. Good idea?
Well, for the industry, absolutely, in the sense that the Visit Britain was citing figures that it's lost 15 billion of its predicted £26.5 billion income for this year. I mean, again, the figures are eye-watering. When I first saw the headline, I suppose my first thought was, what are bosses going to think if they've just got their people back to work, if all of a sudden there's another bank holiday? So there'll be, when we move forward out of lockdown, there are going to be a lot of competing demands being made of government. Tourist firms are going to be saying, let's have another bank holiday so we can make up lost ground. Firms might be saying, actually, let's not, because we've got lost ground to make up too. So I think these are the opening gambits in what I think is going to be a series of sort of very difficult decisions for government as to which sectors to help first or most openly and which sectors not to.
So you're nodding. I take it you agree with that, because there is an economic cost, isn't it? Despite the fact everyone loves a bank holiday, it does cost the economy, doesn't it, when there is one? Yeah,
I don't know if you remember, but when it was last year that we were going to have the VE Day bank holiday and it was going to be Friday, there was kind of rage and sort of confusion from lots of people because it was a Friday for a change. It wasn't going to be a Monday. The diaries and calendars all had to be reprinted for those that had got ahead. And then actually the bank holiday didn't really do anything because we were all at home anyway. So it was a very strange event only recently. But I think, the reality is that bank holidays, when these have come up before, the suggestion of additional bank holidays, they're often also reasons that people celebrate. They're normally reasons that bring families together. And I think, wouldn't it be wonderful if we were able to all be together and have those events come October, but it doesn't look like some of the social distancing measures, will actually all be relaxed. But there could still be some that will be in place. So I think there is a huge impact on business and industry.
Okay.
I can see the tourism chiefs are asking for it, but whether or not it's practical or not is a whole other question.
And in one word, apparently loads of Brits are going to be, shunning the foreign holiday and going camping instead. Either of you guys big campers?
No chance.
Absolutely not.
We're singing from the same hymn sheet tonight, guys. I love it. Anna and Joe, thank you very much indeed for joining us.